Welcome to Behind the Podium, Unveiling the Coach. Problem solvers have problems too. So here at Behind the Podium, I, Jared Cohen, and my co-host Alexander Ellis discuss the struggles, philosophies, demands, and practices of the coach, or said more broadly, health and wellness practitioner. To provide quality coaching is to enhance someone's life in an everlasting and unfolding way. This is not easy and requires a lot of due diligence and self-mastery on the part of the coach to be able to perform. So without further ado, join us as we dig deeper into the depths of the coach's mind. Welcome back, or welcome to Behind the Podium, Unveiling the Coach. I am Jared Cohen with my partner in crime,
Alexander Ellis.
And today we are going behind the podium with a repeat. I believe this is our second repeat guest. You may remember this guest from episode 14. He is a man of flow. He is a man of force. Some might dare to say he is Mr. FlowForce Rehab. We are back with Dr. Ben Ramos.
That was phenomenal. 5 stars.
Thanks, man. Yeah, that was I was just kind of feeling that one. So
thanks for having me back, guys.
Yeah, man. It is a pleasure. We certainly loved the first go around, which allowed us to get to know you in a very fully comprehensive way. And for those guests or listeners that haven't heard that episode, definitely go check that out. I think based on where we're going to go today, which is a much more kind of narrow and deeper in scope, it'll be helpful to have that background so that you can contextualize what Ben's saying based on his story, his journey. So yeah, man, we're here to take it up a notch.
I'll do my best.
No pressure.
No pressure. So setting the stage for our topic today, we'll call this a topic on skill transferability versus movement or athletic specificity. And we have a few videos that we'll be referencing that we'll put in the show notes. And mainly we want to just open this conversation up for the purpose of the coach to think about, okay, somebody is saying this, someone else is saying that. Where do I find myself in the middle of 1, 2, 4, 5, many approaches to be able to best be in service of my client or solving the problems of many clients. And so again, bridging that gap between strength conditioning patterns and movements versus skill transferability and athletic specificity. And is it appropriate for coaches to be moving in this direction of thinking about transferability to the extent of changing habits and behaviors, or is that potentially going too far and missing out on some of the other inherent pieces of strength conditioning and the purpose of strength and conditioning?
Mm-hmm. And I think one thing that comes to mind for me is that for a very small percentage of people, they are training for some specific task. And for the rest of us, we're just trying to be stronger, to be faster, to get through the day without hurting ourselves. And so that's kind of the focus I'm interested in, and in my practice too, is how can I serve the people in front of me in a way that will benefit them outside of the classroom, outside of the gym, outside of the yoga studio, or whatever that room is.
Yeah, which is where I think it comes back to that skill transferability piece, is like, I want to always be coaching somebody something that I feel like has value beyond this. It's not just like, this is how you do a squat and that's it. You know, that there's something else that can be taught, not just psychologically, but also biomechanically to suggest like how these patterns, this conscious practice of movement can benefit someone just walking or going for a hike or enjoying movement beyond the canned experience of exercise or a training session.
Mm-hmm. I'm saying for you, Dr. Ben, I mean, that's what you do, right? I mean, people come to you and they want to get back to their activity pain-free.
Right, absolutely. And so I would say, I think like what Alex is saying is about fitness. The majority of the time that we're talking about this type of stuff, like when you're talking about training, you're talking about fitness, right? Mm-hmm. Which is going to be in a different bucket than if you're talking about somebody that's preparing for an athletic event or a specific, sport. It's going to be a kind of a different population. And then when you start factoring in pain, it's a whole nother ball game. It's
yeah, that's true.
It is and isn't. They obviously all mingle, but it's a different kind of ball game as well. So there are different buckets that they'll be, kind of divided up into. Mm-hmm. I think to Jared's point though, I think what you explained about like talking about how these patterns, like, a squat or what have you, how that transfers into other life, having this bigger picture that you can relate to that makes people like more engaged in training is a part of what makes us inherently try to like associate these patterns with how this is going to benefit you in all these different ways. Mm-hmm. But I think making it more complex is what has kind of like taken us down this route of that urge for complexity to make it even more than it is has taken us down this route of building it up bigger and making it more than what it really is,
Right.
As we can just say that, getting strong is good.
Right.
And movement is good and movement practice is good, versus like the squat will make you better at, like whatever have you. Like I was reading an article the other day, it was just the blog and it was like, your squat will not make you better at physics.
Right.
Or, your squat's not going to help you, not going to help you sink more baskets,
Mm-hmm. Well, and also too, when there are these very rigid rules about how a exercise or pose has to be executed, what about the times where you do have to squat down to get something, but you're under your sink, and so maybe you do come up onto your toes, or maybe all of your weight is on one side. Like in the real world, there are so many different variables that to say in training it can only be this. Like, what about everything else?
Right. Exactly. And that goes back to like, what is the goal? I think like you said, Alex, like it all comes back no matter what you're training for, whether it's fitness or whether it's sports or whether it's, somebody that's in pain, that's rehabbing from an injury, or whether it's a mom that wants to pick up her kid, there's a goal involved. Right. And then you're trying to work towards that goal the whole time. And if we call those activities of daily living, if somebody needs to be able to reach under their sink or reach up into their cabinet, those are ADLs. So we're trying to, that would be like more of a rehab thing. We're trying to enhance this person's, functional ability. But so that's just a different spectrum of where it's at. In the end, it's what's the goal? What are we trying to achieve? Right. So. I mean, that's really what it all comes back down to in the end. And so when Jared and I were talking about like foot positioning, like what is the goal of the squat? The goal of the squat isn't about, trying to get you better at this specific skill from a technical standpoint. It's to make you stronger, more powerful, so you can go do that skill more and you can be better with your body and better at using your body in order to use that skill. Not that you're using the squat in order to build a skill other than the squat, because it is your training is specific.
Mm-hmm.
Specific to the squat.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So like in the video that we were watching, they were talking about the squat and foot position and comparing that to lining up on the football field.
Right.
And then they were comparing that to change of direction stuff, and why they use a specific foot position for the squat, but the squat is such a completely different task than what was being used as an example for what you're trying to do. You know, squat, you're fighting against gravity to push a barbell, you know, up. You know, the force is going directly, you know, in the opposite direction of gravity. Whereas, you know, if you're lining up on a football field, there's a dude standing in front of you, so that's more like a horizontal output of force. You know.
Yeah, and what about the guy who falls sideways into you? You don't practice that with the barbell.
Right.
So just so our listeners know, this will be in the show notes, but this is a video in which John Wellborn is at the SEAL Fit Academy and briefly talking about why he would coach people to squat with their feet straight because of how it transfers over to athletic performance, particularly in his case, being on the football field as a offensive or defensive lineman and having to abruptly change direction.
Right. And so when it comes to, like, you know, and the squat is probably one of the biggest things that's used as an example for that. And there's all kinds of different people that, you know, that have their ideas about how or why to squat with straight feet, you know, and how it transfers to skill. But that all kind of falls apart when you start looking at the specificity of the actual skill that you're using. You know, you want to squat, you're using a super heavy load and everything, right? Like, first of all, you want it to be safe. You want it to be a productive movement for that person, you know, and you want it to be sustainable. So my biggest thing that I have with patients that come to me, you know, from athletes or people that train a lot, is that oftentimes they've been somewhere, form or another, or along the way. Sometimes it was just their high school football coach that was also their weightlifting coach, you know, told them that they needed to do something a certain way, that they've always done it that way. But they never even dreamed, like, you know, in their wildest dreams that they can like toe out a little bit, you know? Right. And then instead of me sitting there and giving them 10,000 cues and telling them to push here, move here, twist here, torque, you know, you tell them to toe out a little bit, and the body just kind of like self-organizes, and the brain takes over, and it makes it, you know, makes the movement, it produces the movement that you're looking to produce, and they're able to train harder and safer. So
yeah, because for each person, because of their structure, their specific needs in any shape are going to be different, right?
100%. And that's something that McGill touches on quite a bit when it comes to the hip architecture, and based on areas that you're from in the world, right? Like, there's the Eastern Bloc, and these countries that have a higher rate of hip dysplasia also have a shallower hip socket, and it also predisposes them to be, it's more advantageous for them when it comes to Olympic weightlifting, right? Versus what they call the Scottish hip, which is a deeper hip socket, more anterior into the pelvis, which makes it disadvantageous for somebody that needs to do a really low squat while maintaining that, you know, that upright torso that's associated with Olympic weightlifting. You know, or even like, you know, a runner, a sprinter, you know, is generally going to have a hip socket. You know, this is not everyone, you know, that's going to change, but, you know, they're going to have a hip socket that's deeper and that's more anterior, so that they are able to, you know, produce better force in that direction. Right. Which is something that over time, people just kind of fall into buckets on their own, right? Like, I mean, if you're tall and lanky, you might end up playing basketball, or you might end up playing volleyball, right? And if you're short and stout, then you probably enjoy lifting weights because, you know, it comes easier to you, you know?
Yeah, very true. I mean, you know, I started off playing soccer and softball when I was growing up. And at some point I was like, you know, this isn't that great for me anymore. And so people, like you're saying, they do self-select and they choose, you know, different paths that lead them out of the activity, but probably is because of structure or just how they move.
Right. And the thing is, the interesting part of that is that people come through that and they don't realize that process, and then they get to the highest level of whatever sport, and they base, you know, rules that they that they lay across for everybody to use, because this is what needs to be done in order to get to the highest level of the sport, or the highest level. This is what needs to be done. This is how it's done at the highest level. This is how anybody that wants to do a snatch should do it, because this is how the highest level snatchers do it. But they don't see the pile of bodies that fell off along the way, that that tried, but it didn't work for them. Because you don't see the dropout rates. Like, when you're doing scientific studies, you understand dropouts, and that's all accounted for. When it comes to these anecdotal, type of like statements and how people approach training, you don't hear about those people, how many people stopped doing jiu-jitsu because they just, their bodies fell apart, or they didn't feel that they were durable enough to do it, and it hurt them in such a fashion that they didn't want to do it anymore, or vice versa for any training type of scheme, like, I didn't like doing that. I felt, bad doing it. I didn't take to it well, or maybe not even that. Maybe they just didn't have a good coach,
So where do we fit in? Where do we fit into this conversation, the discussion or topics related to what someone would consider a good position versus a bad position, or a good mechanic versus some kind of positional inhibition? If we're, on one hand, accepting this individual variation, like where is the line drawn to say that, this is some set of movement ideal that we have as a framework that we're trying to help people move toward, even if maybe they can't completely get there, similar to how if, someone was getting some lab work done, we would say, we want you to be in this range for optimal health. Is there something to that within a movement space biomechanically, and for coaches to be cognizant of within this whole dialogue?
Well, I think it's very, very, it's a continuum. There's not a specific space. And like you use the example of like blood labs, blood labs is a good example, because like when you're talking about screening for pathology, you're talking about screening for things that, that the way that screening works, and the reason that it hasn't, like the FMS hasn't caught on from like a scientific point of view, is because the way screening works is you're able to identify these specific areas, and you're able to come up with these specific percentages of all right, we screen this many people will have it, this many people won't have it. This is the likelihood, and we can treat it, right? But when it comes to movement, we haven't exactly found that with a lot of the movement screens that we use. But it's a continuum, and it's context specific based on the person that's in front of you. You can't, apply it all across the field. Obviously, there's certain things like knee valgus with ACLs where everybody will probably be a little bit more aware of. But, some people, their knee crosses, their knee dips in medial a little bit. And in some cases, that is much more advantageous for them to do. Like, you could look at Usain Bolt in that one video that went cruising all over the internet with him coming off the starting blocks. And his knee was like, his knees were they were way past midline, But I'm not going to tell Usain Bolt he's running wrong,
But not necessarily telling him he's running wrong, but do you see that and potentially say, hey, there's a risk of injury? Like, because I think we have to be careful about like waiting till there's pain, right, to suggest there's an issue. Isn't that the whole point of having some visionary understanding of patterns and force vectors in order to suggest, hey, we got to be mindful of this thing out of respect for the potentiality that something may go wrong in the future? Or do we just let it be because we say, hey, he's the best in the world and he's not in pain?
No, I mean, obviously you want to have some sort of baselines that you want to make sure that somebody's safe in doing, right? What is that though? it's different for every single coach, no matter who it is that you're talking to, and it's different within every single discipline. And I came out of that school of thought, and that's why people gravitate to the FMS and SFMA and the functional movement system. I mean, it's a great system and it's a great baseline, but there's parameters to follow, there's instructions of how you use your words to follow. And that makes it easier for people to use it, and work within the confines of it. But unfortunately, that's not exactly how every human being works. And so you have to be flexible. And I think they account for that in their systems as well. But I think that people that take their systems sometimes don't themselves when they apply it. They stick to it a little bit more rigid. So I'm not trying to knock them.
Right,
I mean, they have great systems.
Of course.
I learn a lot from those guys all the time. But I mean, there was just something in the British Journal of Sports Medicine, British Sports Medicine Journal, about why movement screens just haven't come to fruition of being haven't been very
gold standard.
Well, not even gold standard. They kind of advocate against using them. That they haven't really been too useful because there's so much play in there as far as what's the benefit. And I think when you're talking about different kind of movements and trying to make a gold standard, the body is so adaptable that some people, if trained from birth, they have a certain way they move, they have a certain way they do things. You look at some high level endurance runners and you look at their mechanics, they've consistently trained and adapted their body to run in a certain manner that has become super efficient for them. But if you were to be early in school, like myself, coming out of biomechanics classes, I would look at it and be like, oh my God, how are they alive?
Yeah.
And that's natural. Everybody comes from a certain position of where you're learning and I was there, but here's the interesting thing. And this is why I was telling you guys earlier about Greg Lehman's course. For me, it was pivotal because it allowed me to open up and start thinking outside the box a little bit. Nobody, up to my point in my education, nobody had really talked to me like that, about, more about the adaptability of the body and how, how much variation there can be.
But adaptability is not necessarily a good thing, right? That a lot of us also adapt to some really bad habits and compensations. And so that's where, because I think you see this in sport a lot, right? Where someone has created certain adaptations that have made them really successful in their sport, but really unsuccessful in the rest of their life as it pertains to they're in a lot of pain because of the compensations or adaptations that they ended up making in this one discipline, but now, maybe their hips are slightly off axis, or, one foot is constantly more weighted than another. So where do you circle back around in trying to create more of an equilibrium of the experience, and potentially also say well, even though this adaptation is singularly good, we should be cautious of allowing that to go further because of how it's going to have unintended consequences elsewhere.
What's the goal? There's a cost benefit ratio to all that stuff that you're talking about, and if when we talk about elite athleticism, you're almost always talking about running your body into the ground. Not to say that everybody does it and everybody has to, but these people, the goal is the podium. Right. What's going on other than that is an afterthought most of the time. Look at the NFL, a lot of those guys are pretty beat up when they get done and they're prepared. That's what they're putting their bodies through.
But it starts somewhere though, right? Because I feel like a lot of the, as youth athletes, right, that there's this sense of this could be the next one. And so then coaches kind of start pushing perhaps too one-dimensionally in that direction of okay, let's have him adapt as we have seen to be successful for this endeavor. But is that short-sighted in how that adaptation is going to be problematic in other domains? And is there a potentiality to say like, well, maybe there's a better way where this person can still pursue the high levels, but not have to make adaptations that are going to be compromising or dead ends in other respects? Right.
And so the example of like a youth athlete in that respect is that's the adaptation is not occurring, you know? And so when you're talking about people, so the youth athlete thing, I can go on for like a whole long time about specifically. I'm pretty passionate about that one, but you know, there is when people are not adapting, right? So yes, their body is trying to adapt, but there's failure. There's failure along the way because of the overuse and stuff like that. And then these people are doing what they can do to accomplish the goal, which is get that bar overhead. So that's when you see people that are like, you know, doing their best to get the barbell overhead, and they're doing it effectively, but at what cost elsewhere, right? Right. But there's people that do that, and they take the time, and over time their body adapts, and so they have an overhead snatch that looks like shit on everybody else's account, but it works for them, and they don't have trouble, you know? So it's really it's very, very context specific when you do encounter those things. So yeah, like on a coach level, you're going to have baselines of what you want to see, and baselines on like, you know, these are the kind of injuries people face, so this is what we're going to kind of tailor things to. But you know, it's hard to be as specific as you'd like. So, I mean, me personally, yeah, I'm going to try to coach people out of not having their knees knocked together when they're landing, you know. I'm going to try to make it so people don't have shoulders rolled forward if they're overhead athletes all the time, you know, so I can give them, but
so you
really
do have those baselines.
Right. But really part of it is also variability, right? So it's not to say that you don't ever allow those kind of things to occur either, because is it that this is the proper way to move, or is it that we just need to provide this person with more options so they are able to adapt more and they're not overloading in one space all the time? You know, and it's interesting you said that in one of those videos, the wall ball video.
Yeah.
And K-Star was talking about somebody throwing a wall ball and it looking the exact same every time. You want it to look the exact same every time, you know? But if you look in studies of movement variability, when it comes to like an expert, and like the prime example is when they talk about like, you know, people swinging hammers, you know? But the trail, the actual outline of where the hammer swings is different, you know, for an expert every single time. There's a huge amount of variability, but it still hits the target, right? I could send you a link for like Ben Cormack's blog, Core Kinetic, covers this really in depth. He's somebody that I really follow. And for everybody listening, just so you guys know, I'm regurgitating stuff I hear from other smart people. So along the way, I'll reference them so you can, you know.
Appreciate it. Cite the sources, man. So yeah, just again for the listeners, this is another video we'll have in the show notes. Unfortunately, if you are not a subscriber of the Mobility WOD Pro, you may not be able to access this, but so you know what Ben is referring to, this is a video in which Kelly Starrett is he's analyzing someone's foot and ankle position while doing wall balls. This is part of the his like segment, which he calls the coach's eye, and taking a closer look at what variability is happening with this person as it pertains to their foot position. And Kelly's making the argument that in this canned environment or this blocked environment of the gym space, as coaches, we should be helping our clients avoid that variability per that movement in order to make sure everything continues to stay loaded in a very equal manner for that force production.
But I was just thinking of teaching beginners, because oftentimes I'll have somebody walk into a group yoga class who's never done yoga in their life. And you have to give, you know, here are the basic ways that, you know, we can do something. You have to give them the framework, the rules, just to get started. And once they have mastered that, that's where the variability can come in. Then I can say, well, why don't you try it this way? Or what if you do it that way? And for them to then really discover what works best in their bodies. Because just as you're saying, it's going to be completely different for every person. And who am I to say what you should and should be doing? I'm not in your body.
No, you're absolutely right.
Total
Like it's from a baseline like coaching standpoint, it's difficult. Like you have to have your personal principles that you abide by. Right.
Mm-hmm. Right. You have to have some theoretical approach, some philosophical orientation. Otherwise, you're going to be fucking lost.
Yeah.
And you know what? Like, and I'm a beginner too. And so I like having those things, I like having, some sort of guideline to work off of, but like we talked about before, it has to be principle based and not method based, Yoga is a good example too, because I work with people, and I'm biased because I work with people in pain a lot, and yoga is one of those things, yoga or Pilates or any exercise you can say, like I like to say there's no bad exercise, but not all exercise or movement is for a specific person, so you can have somebody that goes to yoga and yoga is the best thing that ever happened to them. And you can have another person that goes to yoga and yoga like wrecks my life. And then like I feel pain all the time afterwards, but it's just specific to that person and the poses they're doing. But I think if you have like a good yoga teacher, like identify the limitations of somebody in certain positions, you can see they're uncomfortable and can do modifications to keep them involved, but keep them out of pain. That's where the value comes in. And that's, I think, what you're talking about, Alex, like, you're, as a yoga teacher, your ability to identify that and get specific with that student, and not have them confined to constraints that may not be the best for them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think too, just as coaches, you have to actually be paying attention to what's going on in your classroom, which can be challenging in a group space when you have, maybe 15 different bodies moving in 5,000 different directions. But as coaches and yoga teachers and just movement people, like we have to be watching the bodies in front of us. To just stand up there and, I'm getting on my soapbox, but to just stand up there and just, say things and not look at the person in front of you is a waste of all of our time.
And it's not a coach either, right?
No, like you're just
it's an inner trainer.
Talking head here. I don't know what's going on.
But that point, it's specific to the person too, right? Like, so you have your baseline, this is how you're going to do it. But the problem isn't when you're up there and you're telling them, okay, try this, see this person doing this, see this person, this. The problem is when you're trying to when a yoga teacher is yanking on somebody's head, trying to force them into a position that this person's body just doesn't want right now. And they're visibly uncomfortable, but they're trusting this person to put them into that position, right? Like,
yep.
And it's like that in all variety of different spaces, right? So I have patients, I've had multiple patients that have not been they're like when I squat, I'm having problems with my squat. Can you look at my squat? Like my squat's jacked up. My trainer said so.
Right.
And so they have this or that going on with their squat. And they may not have even had a problem, like a physical problem. Like sometimes if somebody comes with pain, they have a certain thing going on with the squat, you can see it and you're like, oh, we can modify it and let's try to make the squat non-painful, Some people don't have a problem, but they're just down on themselves because somebody told them their squat looks like crap, right? Fair enough, But like I've had people that, all you do is change the foot position and it's their squat and they're able to squat pain-free, they feel fine and they're able to push more weight.
Right.
And they feel better about it, which is the goal. Whereas the goal is never to have a perfect squat. Like in most cases, unless you're competing in weightlifting, the goal is not to have like the perfect pristine looking squat. The goal is to get training adaptation so you can do something else. Right. Mm-hmm. So like all that stuff where we're trying to fit people into a specific box is veering off the road of what we're trying to actually accomplish, right? Like if we're making sure that they're safe and we're making sure that the training is productive, we're on the right track, and we're doing things that are sustainable that somebody can continue to do that, isn't gonna like that's not like they can only do once in a while, it's gonna be beneficial.
But I think we need to be careful about the whole goal thing too, though, because that can be spun the wrong way, right? Someone would be like, oh, what's the goal? And they'll be like, get the bar from ground to overhead. And then it's like, oh shit, like, cause there's a lot of ways to do that. Or the goal is lift the heaviest weight possible. The goal is, get the workout done as fast as possible. And so I think the goal orientation is important, but potentially also is being more nuanced or layered in the goals.
Right. Like you got to be safe. Like, you want it to be safe. Otherwise that's not sustainable.
Right.
It's not
What's
sustainable.
the sustainability of it? Yeah. Of the goal. That's a good way to put it too.
And it has to be productive. Is it moving you closer to your goal? If you are doing something that has the potential to keep you out of training, it's like, sure, I lifted a whole lot. Well, my back hurts and now I can't, I can't push as hard as I want to for a week and a half.
Right.
How is that going to benefit you in the long run?
Mm-hmm.
Or like, I deal with youth volleyball athletes, and it's just like they're everything's about jumping higher. Like they got to jump higher. So what are they, they're 4 days a week. All they're doing is jumping, and then they're doing private lessons and all they're doing is jumping. And then they go to the strength and conditioning coach and the parents are like, they need to jump higher,
right.
And they want them to jump more. And it's like, it's unproductive at that point in time.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so for you, going back to this topic around pain, what are there, and if so, what are some visual pathognomonics for pain or the potentiality, right? Like, are we still able, again, we keep saying like, okay, well, there's this individualization. Some people are going to adapt and respond differently. But if I'm working with kind of a general population, or let's say the volleyball team says, hey, Ben, will you come to one of our practices and just watch us move? Through what lens would you be processing their movement, or would it be very open in the sense of like, I can't really make any blanket statements about how everyone's moving and why that may be a cause of their pain or why that may cause pain down the line?
And that's what I mean. It's hard to make blanket statements. Like, do you want people landing with their knees knocking together all the time? Probably not, but some athletes are going to do it and they're going to succeed at it, but in general, yes, if you have like a bunch of like not so strong, tall, like giraffe-esque girls, you're not going to want them to, like, you're going to try to train their landing,
Mm-hmm.
But it's tough to like make blanket statements like that because some people will be able to adapt, and you won't be able to apply your blanket statements to them. But I mean, yeah, for sure. Like, I want people to have more variability, right? I want them to have more movement options. So if somebody has rolled shoulders, that's fine, but I want them to be able to open their shoulders up, and I want them to be able to have full range of motion of their arm, the glenohumeral joint, when they're hitting and when they're pulling back to hit, so they're able to adapt to those areas. If they have, like, for instance, when it comes to performance, if they have rolled shoulders and they only have that one way of doing it, and that's the way they hit every time, then there's the potential to have overuse there. But if they're able to open up, nice opening, Alex.
Thank you.
They're able to open up, then it opens up their range of motion of the shoulder joint and allows them to have, more options. And the more movement options you give somebody, the less of an issue you have. But I mean, there's always the case of load. If when it comes to, biomechanics matters the most when you come to overloading tissues. So right. There's always the case of overloading, but repetitive overuse, you want to have multiple options, but obviously you don't want to overload somebody. You don't want somebody to, like, come down on one leg and let their knee fall in, because that's just a whole bunch of force coming right down. That's, going to overload the ACL. But.
Mm-hmm. And what you were saying just actually reminded me of a conversation I had with a client a couple of weeks ago. And she said, well, when I do this, I have pain. So I stopped doing that and just completely X'd out, all hip flexion with knees extended, because that always caused pain in her lower back. Perfect. But what I think people also, this happens all the time. They say, well, it hurts, so I just won't do it. But then you are discounting all of these other movement options that you might have. So why don't we figure out why that causes pain rather than just completely taking it off the board as a movement option? Like spine stuff too. there's like, oh, spinal flexion is bad or spinal extension is bad. And then people just like stay in their stiff, rigid posture all the time. It's like, that's not any better than all the other movements that are possible.
No, absolutely. So when it comes to pain, that's what I was talking about earlier. When it comes to fitness, when it comes to performance, when it comes to people in pain, it does change. You know, there was an interesting study. I don't know if O'Sullivan did it, but anyways, about people that have back pain, you know, and the variability of their spinal motion versus in people that have had I think it was walking, but in people that have back pain, they have a decreased variability of motion in their back, right? Which could potentially predispose them having more back pain in the future. But the study I was thinking about in the first place I'm pretty sure it was locomotion. It was the way people walked. Mm-hmm. I want to break this out. Hold on.
Let's go on and get the study, guys.
They could, and this is a shout to Ben Cormack, because I'm looking at his notes for something that I found in his course when he was in town. It was
you guys hear that flipping of the paper? It's real.
It's real paper. It's not on the internet. Yeah. What?
No. Really good. Good. Okay, so 3 groups: 1 chronic low back pain, 1 with a single bout of back pain that resolved, and 1 people with no back pain. And they were able to identify each group by the level of variability that decreased with their chronicity. Okay, so it is true that, like, you know, with more pain, you decrease variability of movement because you're trying to splint. And so, like, and they find that with people with ankles, right? Like, it changes locomotor patterns and stuff like that. And they say that, you know, like, your protective mechanism can persist whether or not your tissues heal. So there is that, you know, that's definitely true. So, like, reincorporating movement is important. You know, I'm kind of forgetting where I'm going exactly with this. Oh, but I think with your example of pain, like, is a great example, because that's the point where it needs to be into a clinical situation, right? There needs to be a clinical evaluation of the person that's having that pain in order for a proper treatment approach to be engaged, right? So, like you said, somebody that has, you know, hip flexion with a straight leg. Or with hip flexion while their knee is extended, right? Mm-hmm. And it causes back pain. So, I mean, I'm obviously not seeing this person, but right off the top of my head, because I'm a big neurodynamics nerd, I think about, you know, that it's almost like you're describing a straight leg raise test.
Right.
You know? And so, like, in that case, if somebody didn't have the training to actually evaluate this person's cause of back pain, right, and put together the data of tests that and the history in order to approach it, then you could potentially be working in circles without addressing the direct issue there. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a whole nother segue into another conversation. But I mean, that's where pain totally differs. Like, that's why I like how, like, FMS and SFMA, in the functional movement system, they always talk about pain goes in a different bucket. Like, pain goes to the clinician, you know?
Yeah.
Because it could be anything, you know, like a person that has pain with what's, you know, that let's say, like, you know, if somebody has pain, low back pain, something like that, it's going on chronic for such a long time. They have pain with what sounds like an SLR movement. If we haven't screened for red flags, we don't know it's not cancer. Mm-hmm. You know, and there's specific questions that a person will ask in order to identify whether or not these you know, this person has these red flags, and it's all part of the history. But that's where things really change quite a bit, you know, when you're moving from fitness to pain. So.
Mm-hmm. Can of worms.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's interesting, and I like going back to the analog of nutrition or even blood work, and thinking about our previous guest, Rob Wolf, and his newest book, Wired to Eat, where he makes the point that nutritional studies are showing now that what has often been thought of as a quote-unquote healthy food for someone may actually be an unhealthy food for you, and vice versa. What was quote-unquote thought of as an unhealthy food for everyone is actually a healthy food for you. So there's definitely that individual variation that in a lot of circumstances goes against the grain of how we've maybe otherwise labeled certain things as being good or bad or ideal versus unideal. And it sounds like that's what you're saying when it comes to pain. A coach might have to encourage different mechanics specifically based on those unique circumstances or that unique presentation that person is displaying versus maybe what would be considered ideal to a general population.
No, that's absolutely right. And that's my job, like the majority of the time, is to find a modification in movement. That way that person can continue to perform and continue to do what it is they're trying to do and not experience pain. And so that's where I've kind of started to change my thinking, is like, before I used to think that I was fixing movement patterns. And now that I fixed your movement pattern, you're not going to experience pain because you're doing ideal stuff.
Right.
But now what I'm realizing is that I've made a modification, gave them a movement option to use that doesn't give them the same pain experience. Maybe it doesn't overload this tissue in such a way, or maybe they have a pain neurotag. Maybe their brain associates this pain with this movement, and that hasn't resolved yet, but we're giving them an option so they don't have to experience that. And I think that more often than not, that's what I'm doing. When I have somebody that has a shoulder impingement, right, and I increase their thoracic extension and rotation, am I, correcting a dysfunction, or am I just allowing them more range of motion to move through without overloading their shoulder? So I've kind of moved more in that direction, where I'm thinking of providing movement options that don't give this person pain versus I'm fixing a dysfunction.
Right. And potentially after having the increased option and using that option that doesn't cause pain, that person circles back around to what did cause pain. It doesn't anymore because... And
that's been shown in the studies.
Yeah, the nervous system has relinquished its control.
It's like limping, dude.
Yeah.
It's like limping. You know what I mean? Like, a lot of people have had a rolled ankle. They limp for a while. It's protective, obviously, Eventually, you get back to walking like normal. We used the example earlier that it can change the way people walk after the tissue's healed. But, I would say for the majority of people, you go back to walking and living life like normal. But it's been shown like, you can provide that movement option for somebody, but they may go back to doing their old pattern again. And that's okay. Mm-hmm. Because it may not have been that they were using bad movement. It may have been that they had 4 practices where their coach used physical punishment in every single one. So they had to do, wall sits and wall slides, and then they had to do this or that. And then they had to play 2 tournaments.
Right.
Right. It's not because they have dysfunctional shoulder mechanics.
Right.
It's just simple overuse. And I think understanding that and being more from an athletic perspective, seeing more of the, and even from training perspective, like understanding load management perspective and providing movement options so the person can continue to train, not overload the tissues, has carried more weight in my clinical practice than correcting bad movement.
Nice. That's a very important distinction. And I think what is more important is the fact that as a coach, as a clinician, you have some philosophical orientation that is grounding your approach and giving you more ability to consider the other options because you have your own context from which to filter these different methods out into versus merely just kind of seeing things in a more piecemeal fashion or not having any kind of a home base that directs or keeps your thinking accountable.
And that's from a pain perspective, and that's, I feel lost all the time. Don't get me wrong. I'm lucky that I can reassess in session, or I'm able to see, is this beneficial? I'm able to ask the person,
Yeah, totally. Get that feedback.
Yeah, I get feedback, and that changes. So it's always based on what the person is experiencing, how I move forward in the approach, But then, when it comes to performance, alignment and that sort of stuff is important. Are you able to create force production, maximum force production in this specific movement? Alignment and whatnot will matter. you know, because what you're trying to do is optimize your ability to do something, but that optimization is going to be different for each person, you know, in all sorts of cases. And that person's may be able to use a whole bunch of variety of options to be perfect for that specific moment in time based on the specific context of what happened during that day.
So let's just bring it back to a group scenario here. I know recently, and maybe even more recently, you mentioned where you work, you filled in for one of the coaches to coach a strength conditioning session for a group of volleyball girls, right? And you're in that scenario, you're watching the girls move. What certain things might you see that, without knowing more details, you would be inclined to suggest to one of the girls based on what you're seeing, hey, try it this way, or, you know, I want you to actually do it more this way, without them giving you any feedback, but you making that decision to coach a change because of how you believe that to be more beneficial within this whole training piece, particularly for the sustainability and safety.
You mean like trying to make somebody not have a rounded low back when they deadlift?
Yeah, or if they're
essentially like that, or like if I'm coaching a group of volleyball players, like let's say for instance, if they're doing like a banded walks,
yeah,
and I want them to not have their knees touching each other while they're stepping out,
right?
You know, and
so you would look at stuff. You would make it a point to correct that stuff from a safety standpoint.
Well, and also from a training standpoint, right? Like if I want them to, I know you've done banded walks before. Your glutes are going to feel it a lot more if you got your, you know, if your knees aren't touching each other, if your knees are touching each other, if you're a little bit more upright or something like that, you wouldn't use more quads. What we're trying to do is target like your buns, you know?
Right.
So there's that aspect of it.
Okay,
yeah, I mean, so definitely, I mean, every coach is going to have that. Everybody's going to have that, but it's going to be different for every person. But
for
absolutely,
every coach or for every individual.
Every individual that's in the job of watching people move and directing human movement is going to have their own baselines.
Right. Okay.
You know, so, but here's the funny thing. Is the example I like to use, you know, is I'm big into DNS, you know, and that's what I've studied a whole lot of.
Dynamic neuromuscular stabilization. Right?
Yeah, it's baby movement. All right. So it's based on principles of developmental kinesiology. And there's like the idea that there's an ideal way to move based on your preparedness to move, organized by the CNS. Right. And then it comes down to stabilization, how you're going to move and stuff like that. And within DNS, right, which I love DNS and I use it very much, they're very specific about how you move, right, and how you do things and what's right and what's wrong. But the one knock I have is that if you go to a course, you're going to have the assistant. Here's the hierarchy. You're going to have somebody that's done DNS before. They're going to come correct the hell out of you. Okay. They're going to tell you what's right, what's wrong, and what you're doing. That's the person who's done DNS before. The assistant instructor is going to come and tell that person they're wrong and that this is what's actually going on. You know, then the head instructor is going to come along and then they're going to be like, okay, this is what I'm seeing. This is what's wrong. This is the biggest fault. You know, so regardless of if there's like, you know, this ideal, like these are all people that have extensive training in this one specific discipline and none of them can agree on it. And then it all comes, you know, and then it comes to the big dog. So when like, you know, the head honcho of this movement thing comes along and he wipes out everything they said and he focuses on just this because this is more important. So what I'm saying is that it differs for everybody and that's not necessarily a bad thing. You know, it's okay.
Yeah.
You know, but is it safe?
Yeah.
You know, is the baseline principle of it being safe and is it productive for the goal?
Right.
You know, and everybody who's ever trained somebody in movement has been in a situation where they thought to themselves, I'm glad nobody's taking a picture of this.
Yeah.
Right? Nobody posts their fuck ups on Instagram. Sorry the language, but nobody posts their bad stuff on Instagram. I mean, or at least they don't do it purposely.
Yeah, right.
You know,
Yeah.
people barely talk about their failures on the whole nowadays.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
But let alone do they post it publicly, you know?
Yeah.
But we all have seen it where it's like, dang, like, well, you know what? This person needs to figure this out. You know, I'm gonna let this person do it. Let's not try to overcoach this person. Let's see how it works out.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Yeah.
And a lot of times the body will self-organize.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, I don't have all the answers. Matter of fact, I don't even know if I answered any question definitively.
It's not about answering. It's about exploring.
Yeah.
You know, more of a discussion.
We end up in a gray, murky area where it all depends.
It totally does, though, and it does all depend. And when we're starting out, and us as human beings, we want answers, and you know, it's natural to want to gravitate to answers, and then we lock on to this is the problem, and this is the thing. You know, like the fucking excuse me, I'm getting.
We're already explicit. Don't worry.
I think I started
the psoas. You know, like the psoas, dude, is like the root of all evil.
Yeah.
You know, the diaphragm for a while, the root of all evil. You know, like we all have been, I mean, I've been through it. Like, you know, blaming, oh, this is that, this is the problem, because we inherently want to grab onto something. And, you know, I'm going to tell you, like, from being in practice, like, it doesn't do you any favors telling somebody, you know, I don't know.
Yeah.
You know, it doesn't do you any favors. But if you say, this is what it is, this is what we have to fix, and here's the problem, and it's a big, complex answer, they believe you and they buy in. You know, so it's difficult. It's difficult because we all want answers. We all want direct answers. But the more I learn that there's rarely an answer.
And I think that's a good place to kind of end this in terms, you know, as kind of maybe a new transitioning into a new topic of conversation, this whole thing of like the client coach relationship, the clinician client relationship, and the sort of understanding about what is being communicated. And like you said, I mean, it's this kind of backwards thing where being honest and authentic and owning your own understanding by saying, I don't know, unfortunately has these negative consequences in which now the client, you know, emotionally feels worse about their circumstances when really it shouldn't be that way, because then that's just reinforcing more bullshit being pontificated. But those are kind of real things to consider in that communication process with whomever you're working with, to be thinking about how are they receiving this and being able to unpack that a little further. It's like, look, I know we don't have a definitive answer and that can be more unsettling, but we do have kind of these understandings and, you know, we're moving in a particular direction based on this. And I ultimately hope that as coaches, as a community of coaches, we continue to move in that direction of wanting to be more honest and authentic about what's really happening versus feeding somebody something that isn't really the case just because, you know, in the moment anyway, they might receive that better.
Yeah. I totally
agree. That's
agree.
A tricky balance. So
it's a super hard balance.
One of the struggles. And on that note, I want to make sure we still leave a little bit of time for some rapid fire. I
hope this was beneficial so far. I know we kind of...
No, this is great.
A little bit.
I appreciate, as always, your open-mindedness and your ability.
Exploration,
yeah,
for sure.
It's awesome. And I feel better about kind of thinking through these continuums myself. And I hope the listener feels a little more informed in just hearing the evolution of the conversation, you know, kind of pulling out these different pieces and the ways in which kind of they relate to one another, but there are also a lot of different considerations to be made.
So I literally just sent a message to one of my close mentors, Philip Snell, who you guys will probably hopefully have, you know, on the podcast here soon. I just messaged him the other day, and this is all I said. Like, life was a lot easier when I could blame everything on the diaphragm.
Ah, yes.
It was significantly easier when I could blame everything on the diaphragm. Like, what's your problem? Breathing.
Boom. Yeah, right.
You know?
Moving on. Next problem.
Well, and it's frustrating, right? When you have then you have kind of these anecdotes that take up a lot of internet real estate where someone's like, yeah, I had this client come in and they were complaining all these issues. It turns out I just fixed their breathing and now like they are good to go. Yeah. And then it sort of inflates this belief about this one answer, or like, oh my God, like what's everyone's deal with breathing? Like, why can't they just breathe better? And ultimately that's doing a disservice to the clients out there, even the potential clients, for oversimplifying the complexity that they are going through. I mean, I know I experience it just from like a digestive perspective of like, oh, have you gone paleo? It's like, yeah, I've been there, man. Like it's not that simple. For some, sure, maybe like there are these lowest hanging fruits, but for others, it's not. And I think coaches need to be careful when kind of making some of these gross statements or maybe over celebrating a win that came out of what seemed to be a simple fix.
Oh, dude, over celebrating wins is the name of the game too. I think the fortune really is in the follow up, dude. And
yes, that's good. That's a good one liner.
Like I try to work my best to make sure that I'm following up with people, and be more realistic about my follow-ups. Because there's been situations where like, you hit a home run, but you don't hear from the person. Mm-hmm. There's a 50-50 chance there.
Yeah. I mean, well said. Like
you're celebrating it as I haven't seen this person back. Boom, got them, fixed them. You know what I'm saying? For all that person life got busy. They were, like they didn't have time to come back and see you again. Like, I don't know, maybe you decided not to reach out or you got busy. And then, it turns out that they went right back to the same place after a day and a half and they were stuck in the same spot, and these things happen all the time. Like, so being able to follow up with somebody, making sure you're making that change, making sure that thing's happening, is something that I don't think that people talk about often enough. Like people talk about, they come out of the treatment room, like, dude, had this one back, boom, like, dude, got him, like 100%, change, perfect.
Right.
But then a lot of those cases, people are going to be like, oh yeah, I went back to, like, to 4 out of 10 pain after this, that, but they didn't fucking post that.
Right. Right.
Yeah. Nope.
Fortune is in the follow-up. And that goes back to another episode we had recently with Dr. Tim Gertzmar and his point about businesses having a good CRM system, customer relationship management, so that you really are making sure that there is that follow-up in place and that touch point to not just like show that you care, but to just really make sure you've accounted for everything and you're being real about your own assessment of the efficacy of the work you're doing, and maybe not assuming that this thing is the end all be all, because in reality, if you did follow up, you'd find out that, oh no, there's more going on. And while it seemed to be efficacious temporarily, the thing unfolded further.
On the other hand, maybe everybody's just better than me. Isn't
that the story we all tell ourselves?
Nobody's better than the Ramos.
No, but you're absolutely right, man. Like, it really does come back to following up with people and seeing how they're doing and stuff like that, and seeing how, and setting up the expectations. Properly setting up the expectations, because if you don't set the expectations up properly, that could bite you in the ass no matter how good of a job you do. If you tell them that they're going to get better, you see this get wrapping up in like, potentially like 3 weeks, they get and it takes 4, then they people enjoy that. If you tell somebody it's going to get better in 2 days, it takes 3, they got better in 3 days, they still don't like it because they were expecting 2. If you tell them they get better in 6 weeks, they get better at 5. They're like, hell yeah, I'm ahead of schedule.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, anyway.
On that note, do you have a favorite coaching memory that comes to mind?
A favorite coaching memory that comes to mind? Dang.
It can be recent. It can be something that in which you were the coach or the clinician, or it can be a time in which you were being coached.
I got a good example that kind of comes to mind. This is the first thing that came to mind. Is I did jiu-jitsu with Barrett Yoshida. He was my coach when I was competing like a lot, you know. And I still consider he's like, I got belts on our last, and he's like still considered like my main influence and coach. And we would go to tournaments all the time, and he would compete, and I would just go berserk and like be screaming from the sidelines. The dude knows more about jiu-jitsu than like a million black belts combined, like, you know, and I'm from the sidelines, like as a blue belt trying to scream at him and trying to like identify things. And I remember one time, like before he went out there to compete, he like turned to one of my homies and he goes, "Hey, tell Ben to be quiet this time." You know? And then ever since then, I was just thinking like, yeah, I could probably shut up a little bit. But I wasn't even the coach in that scenario, but I put myself in that role unnecessarily to my own coach who definitely didn't need my input.
Interesting. Nice. It's a nice subtle.
Sometimes you just got to shut up.
Right.
Yep. No truer words have ever been spoken.
Is there a life philosophy that you make a point to remind yourself about every day?
Enjoy the ride.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and I have to remind myself about it, otherwise I won't.
Yeah. No, nice. Yeah. Those reminders are key.
Yeah.
All right, lastly, respond to this however you'd like. This is a quote from T.S. Eliot. "We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time."
Awesome. I dig it. No, yeah, absolutely, man. I mean, the more you learn that that's true.
Yeah.
You know, like the more you learn, the more open you are. Like it goes back to the Dunning-Kruger effect, right? I think, and I don't know if I mentioned that to you guys. I think we talked about that before, but the Dunning-Kruger effect, essentially, you know, the curve of it's a psychology thing. The curve, you know, in the beginning, you feel like an expert with just a little bit of information, and as you continue to learn more, your confidence goes down and down and down.
Yeah.
And then not until you like start really getting into that expert level status as your confidence start building up again. But like it's a long slope down, and I'm definitely still riding the face of that wave, you know?
Yeah. And to your point earlier, you got to enjoy it. Just
enjoy the ride. I didn't know that was actually a studied thing, because for sure, like the more you learn, I'm like, I don't know anything at all. So there's an end in sight to this wave. Thank goodness.
Really? Yeah. What is it? It's like unconscious incompetence, conscious incompetence, then conscious competence, then unconscious competence.
Yeah.
Right? Heard of that before?
Yeah.
So close.
Yeah, you know, like when that's been something I've struggled with for a long time. And when you do yoga tune-up courses, Jill and whomever is teaching usually has you come up with a sankalpa, which is, correct me if I'm wrong, Alex, like Sanskrit for your own internal resolve, right? Like your own kind of centering mantra. And so mine was, and I still use this, I trust my experience while still having faith in the process, which is my reminder to like, just because I'm having a moment of dissonance or confusion is not to discredit everything I've done up until this point, and nonetheless still have faith that, okay, you know, just like, let me marinate with this and it'll find its time to click or somehow fit in correctly. So.
Totally. Yeah. Like one thing that I get caught up in that a lot, dude, like all this stuff that we're talking about just like on this podcast. I mean, how confusing was that? I'm still confused as hell. Like,
Yeah.
But like, you know, that can drag a person down easily, you know, not having the right answer all the time. But like, you know, in the end of the day, like what makes you happy, you know, usually isn't the stuff that we're talking about. Like, you know, it's breathing fresh air, it's your friends, it's your family, and it's that kind of stuff. So when you take that big step back from it all, you're like, dude, I'm a lucky person.
Yeah. That, you know,
being on this podcast, being in a position where I can work in a field like this, you know, being able to like, you know, just breathe, for goodness sake.
Being able to go to Costco and get a bunch of Kirkland stuff.
I was just thinking that.
You know, like first world problems for real, you know? This is a good one.
The wisest one in the room.
What is the subtitle? How you can benefit from social psychologist's most powerful insight. Oh, that sounds great.
Ooh.
I like that picture of like a little someone's grabbing something.
You're so old school with like real books and actually reading papers. Like, what is this?
The book thing is new. The book thing is like probably within the last year I've been trying to actually read more. I've never considered myself a reader.
Mm-hmm.
I'm working that muscle.
Yeah.
You know, I read a good thing in a magazine. There's this magazine called Palette, I believe, which you can find. I found it at Sprouts one time. It's really cool because the whole idea is just documenting a plethora of topics. Like it's just very, it's very diverse. And they had this article in there talking about or comparing the similarities between like finishing a beverage that you really love, like whether it's, it's like a beer or it's a milkshake, and how the fact that it's tangible and visual, like allows you to relish it more, like when you're coming down to those last sips, and that being similar to actually holding a book where you can feel like, oh, there's like
only a few pages
left.
A
few pages, you're like, yeah, like where I'm at. And that is such a different experience than being on the computer where it's like, there's always another click, or even a Kindle where it's not the same. You can't feel the progress or actually relish and cherish in what is diminishing. So I like that.
We talked about this when I told you about a book I read recently called The Organized Mind.
Oh no, I don't remember this.
So a lot of the books I get that I start reading come from Nick Winkelman. He
he's the queuing expert.
And he reads a ton and he posts books, and then it fills up my Amazon account.
Uh-huh.
And Jeff Kubos, he's another smart guy who keeps it on the low, but he's really smart. He reads a lot, so I just kind of follow their breadcrumbs.
Yeah.
But anyways, The Organized Mind talks about reading. I believe it was there when I read it. But anyways, reading on a Kindle or reading on a phone or reading on a computer. Like when we're on a computer, there's all these different tasks that you do on a computer. You're clicking here, you're clicking here. You've got 40 tabs open to all these different pieces of information, and you're skipping around. You're going to email. It's fast paced. When you have a book open, you're doing one thing.
Yeah.
Monotasking. So you're in that zone.
Yeah.
So so that's kind of where I'm at. I like to have the hard copies for the stuff that I'm really trying to learn, and plus it's an investment. You get to keep it.
For sure.
It will not disappear in the cloud.
Exactly.
One day when the cloud just
implodes, it'll happen.
No, yeah.
You still got your books?
You know what it happens? It happens when you drop your phone in the toilet.
The worst.
Passwords, all that kind of stuff, or or like you have some old phone with all that data on it, but wait, they did an update, and
it doesn't work.
Yeah.
Oh, I know that well. Well, Dr. Ben, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today. I'm feeling a little bit more confident in what I know and also more insecure in not knowing anything. So thank you for that.
I brought you to where I'm at.
Yeah. All the show notes, I have a ton and now 1 million book references as well, live over on the website. And where can people hang out with you, find out more, stay up to date with what you're doing?
They can check me out on FlowForceRehab.com, FlowForceRehab.com, or on the FlowForce Rehab Facebook page. I've tried to do a bunch of live videos and stuff like that. They can reach out to me directly at Dr. Ben at FlowForceRehab.com, DRBEN at FlowForceRehab.com, and tell me how wrong I was. Tell me how right I was. Totally open to both of those things. So,
Awesome. Well, thanks again. And just a shout out to those of you listening. If you enjoyed this episode, we would so appreciate it if you would head on over to iTunes and be honest, but 5 or 4-star honesty only with your review.
Yeah.
Or just share with somebody who you think might enjoy being lost as we are.
That's awesome. And thanks again for having me on, guys. It means a lot to me to be in this kind of position, to be able to come on and talk to you guys and spill my brains out a little bit.
Yeah, we're here to catch your brains anytime you want.
man. You're part of the Behind the Podium community.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
All right. Till next time.
Bye.
later, guys.
Hey guys, thanks for listening to Behind the Podium, Unveiling the Coach. If you have enjoyed what you listened to, head over to iTunes and leave us a review. More information on each episode and the podcast in general can be found at behindthepodiumpodcast.com. We'll catch you next time.